Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll build off our last discussion about the different sources of data and talk about how we should configure the data into an ideal format for doing statistical analysis in Minitab. So let's start with identifying those different characteristics for configuring the data. Well, with Minitab as our destination, we need to make sure that we're configuring the data properly so that we could do the ideal analysis that we want within Minitab. So here are a lot of the recommendations and ways that you can configure data to make sure that it's set up appropriately the first time when you load it into Minitab. First of all, each unique record should be set up in rows, not columns. That is, horizontally in rows within the worksheet of Excel or whatever worksheet program you're using. We need to make sure that each unique record is set up across those rows, going across all the columns, but all represented within each rows, not going down through the columns. Now, Minitab has a worksheet interface that's really similar to Excel. The only difference is that in the worksheet interface, where it looks like the grid that you would normally see in Excel, is that Minitab does not allow for the functions that you might perform on the data that's within the cells. Minitab requires that each of the records be represented horizontally in each row, going across multiple columns or fields. Now, there is a way that you can take your data, if it happens to be set up in columns, there is a way that you could take your data to transpose it within Excel. And let me show you how to do that. Here's an example of how you can quickly reconfigure your data into an ideal format as intended for analysis within Minitab. In this example, we have each of these columns represents a record of data, where we have record number 1 that has this name with this amount of sales, record 2 with this name and this amount of sales, and so on for each of these values. Well, for data analysis, this is really difficult to work with. But this isn't very uncommon from how some reports come out of systems and represent the data. So when the system creates these kind of reports for us, it could be very difficult to work with when it happens to be in this format. So one of the ways that you can do this quickly to rearrange it is, rather than copy, pasting, and moving it all over, you could just quickly select all the data that you want to transform, or in this case we call it transposing. I'm going to right click here and select copy, and then I'm going to select another section where I want to paste the results. Now I right click there and now I select paste special. By selecting paste special, I get all these options, and I can still select all these options if I want, but right now what I want to point out is this one that says transpose. By selecting transpose and clicking OK, it copied that data and it transposed it into this format. Now this is the ideal format that we're looking for, where each row, horizontal row here, represents one record of data, and that's the ideal format where we want to represent our data within Minitab. Next, the data should be as detailed as possible. That is, like if we're using system-generated reports, often those reports have summary level type of data. And what's the risk if we're using summarized type of data? Well, the detailed data allows for us to have more samples in our statistical tests. By having more samples, that increases our confidence in the results in order to do the analysis that we're wanting to do. So as an example, if you're wanting to do an analysis on your weight, how often would you normally want to measure your weight? Well, typically we do it on a very periodic basis, like daily or maybe every couple of days, but we're not going to probably get a summary level or get too detailed if we're going to only record our weight once a month, or even less frequent than that. Usually we want to get a detailed level so that way we can monitor the movement. Well, in the same way, we need to have some detailed data within Minitab in order to get to the right level of analysis that we need. Or another example is, suppose you're comparing the average revenue per customer by month or versus by day. And what's the advantage of each one? Well, if you're looking at it month, then you can look at the average overall for the month to account for some of the common cause variation, hopefully not too much special cause variation, but the general revenue that you might see per customer per month. But at the daily level, if you were to have that level of detail, that's where you can do your analysis and you can figure out if there are any problems or errors that you might be seeing, any particular variation at that more detailed level when it's by day. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each, but generally the more detailed you can get in your data for doing analysis, then the better off you are. Each column, which is also called a field of data, should be properly formatted. Statistical tests will generally require that the data be as consistent as possible in using their proper format and data type. That is, whether they're numeric or dates or text or whatever type of data type that we might have. So what we're going to do is in a future session, we'll go over more detail about that when we go over the subject of data characterization. But as a quick summary, that is, we want to make sure that all the data within a particular field, within a particular column, is all consistently in the same data type or data format. That is, if it's something that's generally numeric that we're tracking, then everything in that entire column or field is going to be numeric. Or if it's a date, then it's all representing the same date format. Or if it's going to be something that's in dollars, which again is numeric, but they all have some level of decimal with cents, then again we want to represent that the same way consistently across the entire column. Or if it's text, then that's okay, as long as we're consistent that we have a text, and that's how we're going to do our analysis, knowing that it's text. Again, we just want to make sure we're consistent in how we represent the data. So any column or field that has the wrong data type, Minitab will generally treat that entire field as text. So in other words, if you have some sort of numerical value that you're tracking within a certain column for across all of your records that you're tracking, all you need is just one of those cells to be something that's not numeric. Then it can throw off the entire representation with the Minitab, and Minitab will treat the entire column or that entire field as text instead. So it's really important that you make sure you're consistent across the entire field or column, that you're representing the right data type. For dates, usually they're going to have normal date values like you normally have in Excel. They translate really well from Excel to Minitab. So you might represent yours as month, day, and year, or some other variation of that. The formatting that you use in Excel does not matter, because Excel typically will embed your date as a numerical value. Usually you'll see it in the tens of thousands as it's counting upward from some prior time in history. But Excel will allow you to format it differently, where you want the month, where you want the day, or how you want the year as a 2-digit year or 4-digit year, or whatever formatting you need. But the thing is that you need to be at least consistent and make sure that you're treating it appropriately as a date format, and you're consistent in how you represent it within your data. Such as if you're setting up in Excel, you could have a couple of date formats that are represented. Now if you have this in Excel, if it's not truly a numerical value that's represented as a date in Excel, these are not going to translate well, and Minitab will treat them as text instead. So we'll need to make sure that we're aware of at least the effects that dates can have. Typically from an Oracle-based system, when you output a date, it will come out in a format similar to this one here. And it does not normally translate well if you're viewing your data within Excel. It doesn't automatically translate that to a date, at least not always. So you have to be very careful that if you're exporting your data from a source system like an Oracle-based system or something similar that outputs the date in this type of format, then you just have to make sure, is Excel treating that as a date? If it's not, then you'll need to convert this to represent an actual date value. So that way when you represent the date value, if it's a critical field where you're doing analysis, then you make sure it represents the data type appropriately. That is, make sure it represents the date appropriately in Excel. That way when you transfer it to Minitab for your data analysis, or wherever you're going to do your data analysis, at least it's representing the right data type that you're intending. Also for numbers, Minitab requires that every cell in the column, except for null values, that is like empty values, that they only have numeric values. Again, any text that you might have embedded in there, or if you have some other character like spaces included with your numbers, or a $sign, or some other value, then Minitab is going to treat that as text for the entire column instead. Now it's okay if you have unique formatting in Excel to represent your numerical values. The critical thing is that you actually don't have those values, those textual characters embedded as the value within the cell. Again, for example, $sign. Excel will take the number 100 and you can convert it to a dollar format, and it will add the $sign in front and add a decimal or whatever way you want to represent as a dollar number. However, Excel naturally embeds that value as 100, and it does not contain the $sign or any other symbols like the decimal or anything like that. It doesn't contain those as textual characters within the value. So that's normally okay. But just be aware to make sure that you truly only have numbers there. If you typed in those values like a $sign or typed in a decimal as a textual character, then that will not translate well when you pass it over back into Minitab. Now for text values, Minitab allows for text, and that's perfectly okay. I just have to be aware that it's not going to be able to do the same type of statistical analysis like you normally would do for numerical values. But when you do have text, it's important that you at least be consistent and unique in how you identify the textual values if you plan on doing analysis. Now the text values are usually where you might treat them like a discrete value. And as a discrete value, similar to like a true, false, yes, no, or some sort of characteristic like a geographic area or department or region or things like that that are textual representations of some discrete attribute or value. Well, Minitab will allow for those textual values, but again, we want to make sure we're consistent. So as an example, if you have a value representing the states within the United States, well, you might have one for the state of Kansas where you spell out the word, and another one with the abbreviation of KS representing Kansas. Both of these are Kansas, both of those are accurate, but when you work with your data in Minitab, it's going to treat these as two distinct values. It's no longer consistent. And if you happen to do this for all 50 states in the US, then you're actually going to end up with 100 unique values if you have some of those names spelled out as well as having the abbreviations. So the key here is just be consistent. If this is a discrete value that you plan on doing data analysis on, then at least make sure that you represent your data uniquely and consistently, so that way when you do your analysis, then it's not giving you some false information or giving you some false positives or false negatives because you haven't represented the data correctly. Finally, for null values, Minitab can analyze null values. It is possible to do that, but usually when you have a null value that you're passing, again, null meaning it's a blank. There is no value in the cell itself. It's just completely blank. Sometimes blanks are treated differently in Excel, so you have to be careful in how it's represented. But the point is, if you have a cell that's blank in Excel, then that's okay. It will pass perfectly fine to Minitab, and usually what Minitab will do is it will convert that value to represent an asterisk instead. It will show as an asterisk. The asterisk won't be the value itself, but it'll at least represent that it's a null value. This may sound a little confusing, so let's walk through an example of how we can configure some of the data in Excel. Here's an example of some fictitious data that we put into Excel just so you can see that this represents sometimes how data is spit out of a source system into a report format, or sometimes I've seen folks actually record this type of data from other source systems and it's tracked in this way. Now just to see how the data is represented here, in this example every row does represent one record, and that's the appropriate format that we want to have, but the problem here is that if you notice right here we have these columns represent the month of March, and then right next to it we have, well, that's March for call volume, call length, and call length goal. Well, then right next to it here's April's call volume, call length, and call length goal. Then May. Well, it's not very ideal when you have March set up right next to April, set up right next to May. That might be fine for some of the analysis we're doing in Excel, or if we're trying to do some particular charting within Excel, but for statistical analysis this is not the ideal format. As well, if you notice, we've got some additional ones here where we have some more March data. Now for March we have this one called the percent of problem resolved goal, and the surveys. Then it goes into some additional values for April, and then again some additional values for May. And then we have some additional values even further to the right represented for March. So this is where we really need to be careful in how we're representing our data within Excel and how we're going to eventually configure it for Minitab. So now what I'm going to show you is how we would want to ideally set this data up so that way we can get to the proper configuration we want for Minitab. Now what we have here is a more ideal format for configuring our data for doing analysis within Minitab. It's the same exact set of data. The only difference is, again, we have the same information up front for each of these records, and each of these records are represented on each row here, and that's the ideal thing that we want. But if you recall what we had before, we had with these call volume, call length, and call length goal, and all these different values across the top here represented as different columns, we had these same things repeated for March, April, and May. So instead what we did is we took the values for March and we threw them all into one record like this, and we added this new field here called month and year because that represents the time period that the data that we're looking at. And then with what we had as April, we combined those together again, duplicated the data that was here. This portion is the same exact portion that is up here at the top, where we have as an example. Here's this VP who is Curry in Madrid, who's the same information that we have represented right here. So we are doing some repetition, but the difference here is now here's the April portion that we're aligning down here. And then we continued on repeating it again, Curry in Madrid, and there's their May information. This type of format makes it a lot easier because now, instead of looking at these time periods going all the way across, now we can compare the results from month to month. And by aligning it this way, in this configuration here, it makes it a lot easier for us to do this type of analysis within Minitab. Now, granted, this format is not the most ideal format if we're trying to set up like a database where we want to use some relational data where we have the repetition of these values here. But that's not what we're trying to do here. And because that's not what we're trying to do, then it's perfectly fine for us to set it up in this different format, because our goal is not to create this as a database for storing the data. Our goal is to configure the data appropriately for our statistical analysis. This type of layout of that poor layout that was shown before, where we had the months spread out across all these columns, that type of format wasn't ideal, but this type of format is more ideal for doing the type of statistical analysis where we want to compare the performance of all these different metrics from period to period. All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way. What I'd like you to do is just work with those same files and examples that I just showed you so you can get some hands-on experience of how to configure data for analysis within Minitab. So open the file that's provided, the XLS file that we went over in this lesson, and I want you to try to configure the data yourself for how you think the ideal format would be for doing analysis within Minitab. For example, you want to arrange the data so that each unique record is set up within rows and not in columns as some of the data is represented. Also, try to arrange the data so that there are no redundant columns like we've seen. For example, the data that was spread across the different months, and I showed how they restacked the data in order to properly align it for doing analysis within Minitab. Try to practice that and see how you can align the data and do some quick copying and pasting and moving and configuring the data to make sure it gets into that ideal format. Also, ensure the data is as detailed as possible. Make sure there are no summarized values that are in the data. If there is any summary data, you really don't need it. So try to get rid of any of that summarized data. Also, ensure that the formatting for the data is correct. That is, that if there's a date value that's represented, then it truly represents a date, and it's consistent across the entire column within that field where the date values are contained. Or that if there's a column or field that has numerical values, make sure that the numerical values are truly represented across the entire column and field itself. That's the kind of thing you want to look for. And then finally, after you've gone through that, try to compare your results with the other example that's provided where I showed the reformatted version of that data. Now, as you compare those differences, how many differences do you see between the example that was provided as well as the example that you had worked with in reconfiguring? And then how do you think those differences between the two examples would actually affect the analysis that we would eventually do in Minitab? Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.